Colleges and universities across the country have closed their doors because of the coronavirus pandemic, moving to online or distance learning. And while today's students are very much at home in the digital realm, for one islander, nothing compares to being in a classroom. Our Nora Perez has an exclusive look at how the shutdown has affected higher learning.
But that wasn't that big of a change for a student like me because all my assignments were already online to begin with.
Kai Powell, a first-year student at Texas A&M University Corpus Christi, says the technical aspect of learning online hasn't changed much, but some things are different, like group projects and presentations.
It is definitely going to be a little harder to complete these things, but it's not impossible.
For now, he's keeping up with his work, and he says his professors, while continuing to hold students accountable, are understanding of this extraordinary situation. Still, Powell does miss being in the lecture room.
It's definitely going to have some sort of decrease in my learning ability because I don't have that face-to-face connection with the professor anymore.
Nora Perez, 3 News.